I remember the slip of parchment more clearly than I remember his face, and that knowledge shames me more than any sin I have ever committed. It was thin, brittle, treated with oils and prayers so it would not decay before its purpose was fulfilled. It waited for me on the Hive's rusted intake shelf, balanced carefully beneath the sputtering lumen, globe as if placed with reverence. The seals stamped upon it were crimson and black, layered over one another like old scabs. I could not read their meaning, but I knew better than to ask what authority they represented. In the Hive, questions were a luxury reserved for those with nothing left to lose. The words themselves were written in flawless High Gothic, precise and cold, the kind of language designed to sound eternal. Labor allocation concluded in service to the throne. That was how they described his death. Not slain, not crushed, not dissolved in industrial runoff or rendered down into something useful. Concluded. As if my husband had been a task, not a man. As if his life had been a process that had reached its final efficiency. No body accompanied the notice. There never is. Bodies complicate matters, invite unauthorized mourning, disrupt schedules. Instead, there was a small stamped addendum at the bottom of the page, indicating the cessation of his ration allotment effective immediately. Ink pressed into parchment, carrying more weight than flesh ever had. I stood there for a long time, holding the notice between fingers cracked from detergent and recycled air. The Hab was quiet in the way only the Hive can be, never truly silent, but momentarily indifferent. Somewhere above me, machinery screamed as it always did. Somewhere below, something heavy fell, followed by a brief, distant cry that was cut short. Life continued its assigned rhythm, uncaring that mine had just been reduced. The walls felt colder after I read it. That was not imagination. The thermal regulators had adjusted automatically, recalculating occupancy. One less body meant one less degree of warmth required. The Hab knew he was gone before I allowed myself to believe it. The machine spirits are always quicker to accept reality than we are. I sat on the edge of the cot we shared, the metal frame groaning beneath my weight. His side was already cooling, not from absence, but from irrelevance. I touched the thin blanket, stained with old sweat and machine oil, and waited for something to happen inside me. A scream, a sob, a collapse. Nothing came. The notice did not instruct me to grieve, so my body did not know how. There are rules about mourning in the Hive, though they are rarely written down. You may cry quietly, briefly, preferably into cloth. You may miss one work shift if you file the appropriate form and accept the penalty deduction. You may not disrupt production. You may not accuse. You may not demand explanations. Above all, you may not suggest that the sacrifice was unnecessary. The Imperium does not tolerate inefficiency, and grief is the least efficient emotion of all. I folded the parchment carefully, creasing it along lines already worn by countless other hands before mine. Notices like this are mass-produced, their wording unchanged for generations. Only the identification numbers differ. I placed it in the small metal reliquary bolted to the wall, beside my work permits and ration slips. Important documents must be kept together, the Hab manual insists. I wondered, briefly, if his death would be audited someday. If some clerk would open that box and confirm that everything had proceeded according to regulation. The thought was comforting in a sick way. To know that his end had been orderly. I tried to remember the last time I had seen him. Not the shape of him bent over a workbench or asleep from exhaustion, but his voice, his smell, the weight of him beside me. Memory is unreliable in the Hive. It erodes under pressure, flattens into utility. I recalled him complaining about the taste of recycled water, joking that one day it would finally dissolve us from the inside. I recalled him counting our ration tokens twice, always twice, afraid of making an error. These were not heroic recollections. They were small, unimportant things, the kind the Imperium never records. The lumen, globe flickered, then steadied. A reminder that power fluctuations were within acceptable parameters. I realized I was still standing, notice clenched in my hand so tightly the edge had cut into my palm. Blood welled, dark and slow. I watched it with distant interest. Pain, at least, was familiar. Pain followed rules. Eventually, I knelt before the wall shrine. It was little more than a stamped icon of the Aquila and a tray for votive slivers, but it was all the faith allotted to our Habtir. I recited the litany of acceptance, my voice flat, my pronunciation careful. I thanked the throne for his service. I asked for the strength to continue mine. I did not ask for him back. That prayer is considered redundant. When I finished, I remained there, forehead pressed to cold metal, breathing in dust and old incense. I waited for absolution, or at least acknowledgement. What I received was a faint hum as the shrine's machine spirit registered my devotion and logged it somewhere far above my understanding. That was when I understood truly that my grief was not mine alone. It belonged to the system now, categorized and controlled. I could feel it being weighed against quotas and resource allocations, judged and found unproductive. From that moment on, I learned to keep it small, folded neatly like the notice itself, hidden away where it would not interfere. I rose, washed the blood from my hand, and prepared for the next shift. His boots were still by the door. I moved them aside to comply with space regulations. The hab felt emptier, but emptiness is common here. And soon it would no longer be remarked upon. By the time the work siren sounded, I had already begun to forget the sound of his breathing. The Imperium does not demand that we stop loving. It simply ensures that love costs more than most of us can afford. The Hive does not give you time to be a widow. It assigns you the title the way it assigns you a work docket, coldly, by category, by what it expects you to produce. I learned that the morning after the notice, when I presented myself at the ration office with my token string and my stamped HAB permit, and found that my hunger had already been logged. The ration office was 3 levels down from my HAB tier, down past the damp stairwells where sump vapors clung to your throat and left a metallic sweetness on your tongue. The walls were lined with rusted pipes that sweated warm condensation, dripping onto the heads of those who waited below like a slow, patient torture. Every few landings a devotional plaque had been bolted into the ferrocrete prayers to the throne, warnings against disorder, diagrams on proper queuing discipline. The words were half erased by grime and fingertips, but the meaning remained: endure, obey, do not obstruct the flow. When I reached the ration office proper, the air changed. It was warmer, not by kindness, but by machinery. Cogitators and ventilation fans exhaled stale heat that smelled of ozone, hot lubricant, and cheap incense. That incense was everywhere, burned in brass cups mounted on the pillars, thick enough to irritate the eyes. It did not elevate the spirit so much as it attempted to cover the truth, the rank, sour stink of too many bodies pressed together, the ammonia bite of sweat, the sharp tang of fear, the Q wound in a rigid serpent across the chamber, guided by waist-high rails. Each rail was painted with devotional warnings and rubbed down to bare metal where desperate hands gripped it. Men, women, children, if the Hive called them children, though they looked like shriveled adults, stood with ration strings wrapped around wrists as if the tokens might flee. Some clutched broken teeth in cloth, trade goods. Others held tin bowls, hoping to be granted a ladle of something warm. There were no conversations. Speech in such places invites attention, and attention invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites penalties. Every few minutes a servo skull drifted overhead, its optics clicking, its little parchment streamers fluttering in the recycled breeze. It made the faint buzzing sound of a fat insect and smelled faintly of old wax and bone. When it paused above someone too long, the person would straighten, eyes forward, face emptied of expression. The skull would drift on. The queue remained intact. My place was near the end. That was another rule: widows did not receive priority. If anything, we were treated as a disruption to the numbers. I held my token string, 37 stamped metal discs, each marked with my HAB code, my worker classification, my authorized intake, and I felt as if I were holding my own pulse in my palm. When I finally reached the front, I stepped up to the counter and looked through the mesh barrier at the clerk. He was not old, but he looked worn in the same way all Hive functionaries do, eyes dulled by repetition, skin waxy from constant proximity to cogitator glow, hair cut close for sanitation. A small cog, toothed icon had been tattooed behind his ear, the mark of the administratum's lesser servants. His hands were stained with ink, and one finger was capped in a brass thimble for stamping. He did not look at my face. He looked at my documents. "Heb tier," he muttered, voice muffled by the rebreather mask required by regulation. Work docket. I slid my HAB permit beneath the mesh in the designated slot, along with the casualty notice. The parchment felt heavier than it should have. The clerk's eyes flicked to the seals, not with sympathy, but with calculation. He lifted it with 2 fingers, as if afraid my grief might stain him. Deceased, he said, and tapped a key on the cogitator behind him. The machine clicked, word, then emitted a series of harsh, mechanical beeps that made my teeth ache. The clerk watched the screen as if it were a holy revelation. Disposal allotment terminated, he recited. Nutrient ration reduced, fuel ration reduced, water ration reduced, HAB heat adjusted to solo occupancy. His voice never changed. Each reduction sounded identical, as though the words had been carved into him. I wanted to protest. Not for the heat. Cold had always been the Hive's default condition, but for the way he said terminated, as though my husband had been an error corrected. The words gathered in my mouth, bitter and useless. I swallowed them. You do not argue with the ledger. The clerk reached beneath the counter and produced a new token string, fewer discs smaller, stamped with my updated classification. He placed it on the counter like a priest placing a relic, and for a heartbeat I could not move. I counted them anyway. 21, 16 less than before, 16 meals, 16 chances to keep my body functioning. He slid a form toward me. The paper was rough, made from recycled fiber, and the ink was faint. At the top, stamped in bold, were words in high Gothic that I could only partially decipher. Below was a series of boxes and lines. Sign, he said. I stared at the form. My hands shook, not from cold this time but from the knowledge that signing was consent. Signing meant I accepted the reduction. Signing meant I agreed that my husband's death had changed my worth. The clerk tapped his brass thimble against the counter in a steady rhythm, like a metronome. Behind me, the queue pressed closer. I felt their impatience like heat against my back. In the corner of the chamber, an enforcer of the local Arbit's precinct stood with a shock maul resting casually against his shoulder. His visor was opaque, his armor dull from use. He did not move, but the threat of him was enough. Everyone knew the stories: a man who shouted about missing rations and was dragged away, his screams cut off behind a door marked with a skull, a woman who wept too loudly and was fined for disturbance, a child caught stealing a token and returned as a servitorized warning. Stories keep the line straight, so I signed. My name looked strange on the page, as if it belonged to someone else. I pressed the stylus harder than necessary, carving the letters into the paper like a confession. The clerk stamped the form with a quick, practiced motion. The stamp made a satisfying crunch, the kind of sound that implies finality. He filed the casualty notice into a slot behind him, where it vanished into darkness. Just like that, my husband became a record stored somewhere in the Hive's belly. He would never emerge again. Next. The clerk called, already reaching for the next set of documents. I stood there a moment longer, token string in my hand, feeling its lightness like insult. Then I moved aside, because that is what the system demands: keep moving, keep flowing, do not clog. The ration dispensary was through another door, where the actual food was distributed. It smelled worse there, a wet, sour odor like spoiled grain mixed with industrial cleaner. The floor was slick, and the drain grates were clogged with bits of unidentifiable sludge. Servitors worked the vats, their movements jerky, their flesh pallid under flickering lights. One had a feeding tube permanently attached to its mouth, dripping nutrient slurry down its chin. It did not wipe it away. It did not seem to notice. A worker behind the counter, human, but with eyes as blank as the servitors, took my new token string and counted it without expression. He dropped a scoop of grayish paste into my bowl. It steamed faintly, but the heat was mostly chemical. The smell made my stomach clench, both in hunger and revulsion. I tasted it on the way out, because hunger does not wait for privacy. It coated my tongue like chalk. The texture was gritty, as if ground bone had been mixed into it. There was a faint, sour aftertaste that reminded me of old milk, though I had never tasted real milk in my life. It was food only in the most bureaucratic sense, nutrients delivered, quota met. I chewed slowly, forcing my jaw to work, and I felt anger rise. Not the righteous kind, not the kind that leads to action. The Hive kills that anger early. This was a small, impotent fury. The kind you swallow because it has nowhere to go. I walked back up the levels to my hab with the bowl tucked under my arm and the new token string wrapped tight around my wrist. The stairwell felt colder now, though perhaps that was because I knew it would stay that way. Each step was an effort. The paste sat heavy in my gut, like punishment. By the time I reached my hab door, the lumen globe outside had dimmed to its designated rest cycle level, though rest is not something the Hive truly permits. I entered and sat at the small metal table that had once been ours. I poured the remaining paste into my mouth and swallowed without tasting, because tasting meant acknowledging what I had become. Love, I realized then, carries no weight on imperial scales. The ledger does not care that I had shared breath with him in this tiny room, that we had counted tokens together, that we had whispered small dreams about better air and softer beds. The ledger only cares that his allocation had ended and mine had been adjusted accordingly. Hunger became constant after that, not the sharp, sudden hunger of a missed meal, but a dull ache that never left. It lived in my bones, in my muscles, in the tremor of my hands. It was the Hive's way of reminding me, with each gnawing pang, that survival is not guaranteed. It is merely delayed, rationed out in small, regulated amounts, and every time I ate, the chalk taste lingering on my tongue, I felt resentment settle deeper inside me. Quiet, contained, efficient. Nights in the Hive are not dark. They are dimmer perhaps, but never mercifully so. The lumen globes outside my hab door shifted to their low cycle glow, casting everything in sickly amber, and the air recyclers dropped to a slower, more economical rhythm. That was how the Hive marked rest, by reducing expenditure, not by granting peace. It was in those hours that I felt his absence most sharply, because the noise changed. When he was alive, the sounds of the hab block had blended into something almost tolerable. His breathing had been there, soft and uneven, a human rhythm against the endless mechanical roar. Now that space was empty, and every other sound rushed in to claim it. The cough of the old man 3 habs down, wet and rattling like something trying to escape his chest. The muffled argument from above, words indistinct but anger unmistakable. The distant scream that rose from somewhere deep in the block, cut short so abruptly it made my skin prickle. Machinery never slept, pistons thumped, conveyors whined, and somewhere a warning klaxon pulsed at irregular intervals, a reminder that something, somewhere was failing. I lay on the cot alone, staring up at the ceiling plates where rust bloomed in organic patterns. Condensation dripped steadily from a seam above me, each drop landing with a soft, mocking tap. I counted them at first, the way I used to count his breaths when I could not sleep. It did not help. The empty side of the cot felt like a wound. The blanket lay undisturbed, folded where his weight had once pressed it down. I reached out without thinking, my fingers brushing cold fabric. For a moment, I imagined warmth there, imagined the faint smell of machine oil and sweat that had clung to him no matter how much he washed. The illusion collapsed as quickly as it formed, leaving only the cold. I began to speak to him then, not aloud, not at first. I moved my lips silently, shaping words meant for his ears alone. I told him about the ration office, about the clerk's flat voice, and the way my token string felt lighter in my hand. I told him I was angry at him for dying, even though I knew it was not a choice he had been offered. I told him I was afraid. The Hive teaches you to be careful with spoken words, but in the privacy of my own head, I allowed myself that treason. Eventually, the silence pressed too hard, and I whispered. My voice sounded strange in the empty hab, too loud, as if it did not belong there anymore. The walls seemed to lean in, the thin ferrocrete panels transmitting every sound beyond them. I kept my words low, broken, more breath than speech. Confessions, really. Fears I would never dare voice to another living soul. That I would not last the year on reduced rations. That I would be reassigned. That I would forget the sound of his laugh before I forgot his face. The walls did not answer, but they listened. In the Hive, walls always listen. I had learned early that hab blocks are not built for privacy. Sound travels through pipes, through vents, through the very bones of the structure. Secrets leak the way heat does, seeping away until nothing remains. Trust is thinner than the walls, and far more fragile. I learned to stop whispering after a sharp knock came on my door one night, not from an enforcer, but from a neighbor who hissed at me through the crack to keep it down. Disturbance invites attention. Attention invites audits. After that, I swallowed my words. I lay awake, staring, listening. The hab block had its own rhythms, its own cycles of suffering. A woman down the corridor sobbed every night at the same hour, her cries raw and animal, until one night they stopped. No one spoke of it the next day. A child coughed endlessly in the hab above mine, a thin, hacking sound that grew weaker over weeks. Then there was a thump, a dragging noise and silence. The hive absorbed these losses without comment, the way flesh absorbs a needle. Sometimes in the deeper hours, I could hear the sound of small wings, servo, cherubs on patrol. They drifted through the corridors on grav motors that whined softly, their forms half mechanical, half religious mockery. Chubby metal limbs, flaking paint, childlike faces frozen in beatific smiles. Their optics glowed faintly as they passed, sweeping back and forth, recording, judging. When one lingered outside my door, its shadow stretched long and warped beneath the lumen globe. I held my breath, heart hammering, certain it could hear the sound. Morning itself felt suspicious under that gaze, as if grief were a deviation from approved emotional output. I wondered what parameters they were programmed with. How long is too long to be sad? How quiet is quiet enough? Once, when exhaustion finally dragged me into sleep, I dreamed of him standing at the foot of the cot, his face blurred, his mouth moving without sound. I woke with a start, my heart racing, my mouth full of the taste of recycled air. The dream left me hollow, aching in a way hunger never could. I understood then that sleep would not be a refuge anymore. It would be another place where the hive could reach me. Days bled into nights and back again, marked only by sirens and work bells. My body learned to function on less food, less rest, less warmth. My mind followed, shrinking inward, conserving energy. I stopped thinking of the future, because the future in the hive is an abstract concept, one that rarely applies to individuals like me. Loneliness settled over me like dust. Not a sudden thing, but a slow accumulation, coating everything. It was in the way I ate alone, scraping the bowl clean. In the way I returned to an empty hab, the door sealing shut behind me with a final hiss. In the way no one spoke his name, because names are attachments, and attachments are liabilities. I became careful with my expressions, with my posture, with the way I carried myself through the corridors. A widow who looks too broken invites reassignment. A widow who looks too resilient invites exploitation. I learned to look neutral, a face calibrated for invisibility. Still at night, lying on the cot, I would feel the weight of the hab, block pressing down, thousands of lives stacked above and below me, each one trapped in its own small cell of despair. The echo of the hive was not just sound, it was presence. It was the knowledge that I was surrounded by others and utterly alone. Loneliness, I realized, was another tithe. Not officially recorded, not stamped or signed, but extracted all the same. A cost of living in service to something vast and uncaring. The Imperium did not need my companionship, my thoughts, or my love. It needed my compliance. So I lay there, breathing quietly, swallowing my grief, and listening to the hive breathe around me. I spoke to him only in my thoughts now, careful to keep even those conversations brief, efficient. There was no room for indulgence. The walls listened. The machines listened. Somewhere, everything was being counted. They reassigned me without ceremony, which was how I knew it was permanent. The notice came folded into my work docket, slipped between production quotas and safety litanies, as if it were an afterthought. A simple line of text, stamped and countersigned, informing me that I was to report to Manufacturum Line Theta at the beginning of the next cycle. No condolences, no acknowledgement that the position I was filling had once belonged to my husband. The Imperium does not recognize replacement as loss, only continuity. Line Theta was 3 transit levels away, deeper into the hive's industrial spine. The air grew thicker the closer I got, heavy with particulate matter that scraped the lungs raw. By the time I reached the gate, my throat burned and my eyes watered, though I had learned not to cough. Coughing suggested weakness, and weakness was expensive. The Manufacturum floor was vast in a way that defied comprehension, a cavern of iron and motion stretching beyond the limits of sight. Conveyor belts snaked overhead and underfoot, carrying half assembled components whose purposes I was not permitted to know. Presses slammed down with bone, shaking force, their impacts echoing through my chest. Steam hissed from ruptured valves, carrying the stench of hot metal and chemical solvents. The noise was constant, overwhelming, a physical thing that pressed against the skull until thought itself became difficult. I stood in a line with others like me, widows, the injured, the reassigned. We were easy to identify. We stood too still, too quiet, eyes forward, already resigned. A servitor with a Vox grill for a mouth droned out instructions, its voice flat and metallic, repeating safety warnings that were more prayer than guidance. Around its neck hung a small plaque inscribed with warnings about contamination of sacred machinery. Flesh, we were reminded, was a pollutant. An overseer paced before us, boots ringing against the metal floor. He carried a shock lash coiled at his belt, its charge indicator pulsing faintly. His uniform was stained with oil and blood, the insignia on his collar worn smooth by years of use. When he spoke, his voice cut through the din, amplified by a throat implant that made every word sound like an order from on high. Productivity is devotion, he barked. Deviation is heresy. We were assigned our stations without names, only numbers. Mine was Station 17. I recognized it immediately, the worn edge of the workbench, the slight misalignment in the feed chute. I had stood beside my husband here once, passing components, careful not to slow him down. Now I stood alone. The machine before me was a stamping press, its massive arm rising and falling with brutal precision. My task was simple: feed in the raw components, remove the stamped pieces, discard any that showed visible flaws. The pace was relentless, set not by human capability but by optimal output. There was no pause button, no allowance for fatigue. If you fell behind, the line did not slow. You did. Within the first hour, my hands were raw. The components were sharp-edged, their surfaces etched with microscopic patterns that bit into skin. I wore gloves, but they were thin, already fraying. Each time the press came down, I felt a tremor in my bones, as if my body were slowly being hammered into something flatter, simpler. The overseer walked the line constantly, eyes scanning, lash crackling. When someone faltered, when their hands shook too much, when a component was misaligned, the lash snapped out, delivering a jolt that made muscles seize and lungs spasm. The victim would cry out briefly, then clamp their mouth shut, because sound invited more punishment. The line never stopped. I cut my hand before the second cycle ended. The blade edge of a malformed component sliced across my palm, deep enough that blood welled immediately. I stared at it for half a heartbeat, watching the red bead up, bright and shocking against the gray metal. Then the press descended again, and I had no choice but to continue. Blood dripped onto the machine housing, hissing faintly as it hit a hot surface. The overseer noticed at once. Contamination. He snarled, yanking my arm out of the machine's path and slamming it down on the bench. He sprayed a harsh, smelling disinfectant over the wound, the liquid burning worse than the cut itself. Sacred equipment defiled. I tried to apologize. The words tangled in my mouth, useless. He struck me anyway, not hard enough to cripple, just enough to remind me where I stood in the hierarchy of value. The penalty was logged automatically. A fine deducted from my already meager ration credit. My blood, it seemed, was an inefficiency I would pay for. I wrapped the cut in a strip of cloth torn from my sleeve and returned to work. Pain became background noise, another sensation layered into the overwhelming assault of sound and motion. I focused on the rhythm: feed, remove, discard, feed, remove, discard. A litany, almost soothing in its repetition. Around me, others began to falter. A man 2 stations down collapsed, his knees buckling as his body simply gave up. The press did not care. The machine arm came down on his hand, crushing it into something unrecognizable. His scream cut through the noise for a moment before the overseer's lash silenced him. Servitors arrived within minutes, lifting the broken man with mechanical efficiency. His station was filled before his blood had cooled. I prayed then, not for salvation, but for numbness. The prayer was answered. Hours blurred together. My arms moved without conscious command, muscles aching, joints screaming. The noise lost its sharpness, becoming a dull roar that filled my head. I stopped thinking of anything beyond the next motion. In that state, I almost felt peace. The Hive favors those who surrender their inner lives. When the end of shift klaxon finally sounded, it felt unreal, like a memory from another life. We were dismissed in staggered groups to prevent congestion, our movements slow and stiff. I looked down at my hands, swollen, cut, smeared with grime and dried blood, and felt a distant, academic interest. They were still functional. That was enough. As I left the manufactorum, I passed a tally board listing output figures. The numbers were higher than the previous cycle. A small note of commendation had been added at the bottom, praising the line's increased efficiency despite minor personnel losses. I wondered if my husband's death had been logged the same way. Each shift ended with fewer workers and more orders to meet. The math was simple. The Hive would continue to grind us down until only the most compliant fragments remained. I walked back to my hab with the ache of the machine still vibrating in my bones, my gut throbbing with each heartbeat. I did not think of tomorrow. Tomorrow was already assigned. I went to the shrine because I could not go anywhere else. After the manufactorum. After the noise and the lash, and the endless press of metal against flesh, there was only one sanctioned place left for weakness. The shrine was positioned deliberately between hab tiers and labor sectors, an architectural concession to despair. The Imperium understands that a body pushed too far will eventually break, and broken bodies disrupt production. Faith, administered correctly, acts as reinforcement. The shrine doors were tall and narrow, fashioned from riveted steel plates etched with devotional text so dense it looked like scar tissue. They groaned when opened, the sound echoing down the corridor like a warning. Inside, the air was thick with incense, far heavier than in the ration office. This was not to mask rot, but to smother thought. Each breath tasted of ash and bitter resin, clinging to the back of the throat and making the eyes water. The effect was immediate and intentional, discomfort that forced attention inward. Rows of metal pews filled the chamber, their surfaces worn smooth by generations of kneeling bodies. I slid into one near the back, careful not to disturb those already praying. Faces were bowed, hands clasped, lips moving in silent recitation. No one looked at anyone else. In the shrine, individual suffering dissolved into collective obedience. At the front stood the altar, an imposing mass of steel and stone. The Aquila loomed above it, wings spread wide, stylized and merciless. Candles burned in recessed slots, their flames steady despite the constant airflow, fed by some unseen mechanism. Beneath the altar, servitors scrubbed the floor with stiff brushes, their movements slow and repetitive. Dried blood stained the stone in dark patches that no amount of cleaning seemed to remove entirely. The shrine was a place of healing, but not of cleanliness. The priest emerged from behind the altar, robes trailing, vox amplifier humming softly at his throat. His face was lined, eyes sharp and unblinking, as if he saw only flaws. He began the sermon without greeting, his voice amplified and flattened until it filled the chamber completely. Suffering, he intoned, is not punishment, it is proof. The words washed over me, familiar and heavy. I had heard them all my life, in one form or another. Proof of loyalty, proof of worth, proof that we were still useful. He spoke of sacrifice, of how every hardship endured strengthened the Imperium's foundations. He spoke of widows specifically, though he never used the word. He spoke of those left behind as vessels of continued service, purified by loss. Each sentence felt like a weight placed carefully on my chest, pressing the air out of my lungs. I tried to take comfort in the ritual. I knelt when instructed, pressed my forehead to the cold metal of the pew in front of me. I recited the litanies, my voice blending with the others until it lost its individuality. For a few moments I felt almost lighter, as if the burden had been redistributed among us all. Then the priest's gaze found me. It was not accusatory, not openly hostile. It was assessing, the look of someone evaluating a resource. He gestured, and one of the shrine attendants, a thin man with inked devotional scars across his scalp, approached me quietly. Confession, the attendant whispered, as if offering mercy. I followed him to a small alcove along the shrine's side wall, separated from the main chamber by a perforated metal screen. Inside, the air was cooler. The priest stood waiting, hands folded, expression unreadable. "Speak," he said. I hesitated. Confession is compulsory, but sincerity is dangerous. You are expected to admit to the correct sins, not invent new ones. I feel doubt. I began carefully. In my endurance. The priest nodded, as if this were the most predictable answer in the world. And why do you doubt? He asked. Because I am hungry. Because I am alone. Because my husband died and the ledger does not care. The truth surged up, sharp and hot, pressing against my teeth. I fear, I said instead, that I am not giving enough. The priest smiled then, a thin, satisfied expression. Fear is healthy, he said. It keeps you aligned. He asked about my work, my rations, my prayers. Each answer was weighed, measured against some internal standard I could not see. When I mentioned the pain in my hands, the lingering ache in my joints, his expression did not soften. Pain is a gift, he said. It reminds you that your flesh still has purpose. He assigned my penance with a flick of his wrist. Extra shrine cleaning shifts to be performed after manufacturum hours. Additional litanies to be memorized and recited during labor. A temporary reduction in rest cycle allocation to encourage focus, spiritual correction, he called it. I bowed my head and thanked him. As I turned to leave, I saw the servitors more clearly up close. One had once been a woman, judging by the shape of her jaw and the remnants of hair clinging to her scalp. Her eyes were gone, replaced by lenses that reflected the candlelight. Tubes ran from her torso into a backpack unit humming softly. She scrubbed without pause, her brush moving back and forth over the same blood stain again and again, never making progress, never stopping. Faith, I realized, was another form of labor. When I returned to the pews, the sermon was ending. The priest raised his arms, and we rose as one. The final blessing was delivered with mechanical precision, a formula designed to seal obedience rather than inspire hope. As the congregation dispersed, no one spoke. We filed out in orderly lines, heads bowed, hands clasped. Outside the shrine, the noise of the hive rushed back in, louder than before. The contrast was jarring, like stepping from one kind of oppression into another. I lingered for a moment in the corridor, the smell of incense clinging to my clothes. I felt heavier than when I had entered, as if faith had added to my burden rather than eased it. Guilt gnawed at me now, not for any specific sin, but for the vague sense that I was failing in ways I could not articulate. Even prayer felt monitored, weighed, judged insufficient. On my way back to my hab, I passed a notice board listing those assigned to shrine duty. My name had already been added, stamped in fresh ink. The hive worked quickly when it came to obligation. That night, as I lay on the cot, my hands throbbing, my stomach aching with hunger, I tried to pray. The words felt hollow, stripped of comfort. I recited them anyway, because silence felt more dangerous than faith. I understood then that belief in the Imperium is not about solace. It is about explanation. It tells you why you suffer, and why you must continue to do so. It wraps cruelty in ritual and calls it necessity. Faith had become another weight I carried, heavy with guilt and fear of misstep. And like all the others, it was not optional. The audit began quietly, which was how I knew it would be thorough. There was no siren, no announcement blared through Vox grills. Instead, small changes rippled through the hab, blocked like a chill doors sealed longer than usual, lumen, globes brightening to full diagnostic strength. Servo skulls drifting lower and slower, their optics lingering on faces instead of passing over them. The hive was counting again, and when the hive counts, it does not ask permission. I first noticed the marks on my work docket at the manufacturum. Small sigils stamped in a pale blue ink, almost invisible unless the light hit them just right. I asked no one what they meant. Questions during an audit are noted, and notes have a way of following you. By the third cycle, the notices began to appear. They were posted at corridor intersections and outside ration offices, sheets of stiff parchment affixed with magnetic clamps. Columns of identification codes have designations, worker numbers. Names were rare, numbers were preferred. People gathered around them in tight knots, scanning for familiar sequences, lips moving silently as they traced the lists. When someone found themselves listed, their reaction was always the same, stillness followed by a careful, deliberate step backward, as if distance alone might undo the designation. I found my code on the fourth day. It was halfway down the third column, printed cleanly and without emphasis. There was no explanation beside it, only a secondary mark I did not recognize. I stared at it for a long time, my vision blurring, until the shapes lost meaning and became only ink on paper. A woman beside me let out a small, broken sound when she found her own code. Her hand flew to her mouth, fingers trembling. A moment later, an enforcer stepped in, placed a gloved hand on her shoulder, and guided her away with practiced gentleness. No one intervened. No one met her eyes. The list remained posted, unchanged. Back in my hab, I sat at the table and examined my body as if it belonged to someone else. The audit instructions were clear. Report to the assessment station at the assigned hour. Bring all documentation. Do not eat for 6 hours prior. I followed them precisely. Precision is a form of prayer. The assessment station was set up in what had once been a communal hall, stripped of benches and repurposed with temporary partitions. The air was cold and smelled of antiseptic and old metal. Harsh white lights buzzed overhead, eliminating shadows and mercy in equal measure. The floor was marked with painted lines directing foot traffic, arrows pointing toward processing bays numbered in neat sequence. I queued with others whose faces mirrored my own internal state, tight, expressionless, eyes hollowed by anticipation. Some clutched bundles of documents to their chests. Others carried nothing, either because they had nothing left to prove, or because they had already surrendered to inevitability. When my turn came, I stepped into Bay 7. A Medici functionary stood behind a metal desk, flanked by cogitator screens scrolling with data too fast for human eyes to follow. He wore a stained coat and a rebreather mask, its filters clicking softly with each breath. His hands moved with mechanical efficiency as he gestured for my documents. I slid them across the desk. He scanned them without comment, feeding them into a slot where they disappeared into the machine's depths. "Stand on the platform," he said, voice flat. The platform was cold under my bare feet. Metal bands slid out automatically, clamping around my ankles and wrists, holding me upright. I did not resist. Resistance would be logged. Probes descended from above, touching skin, pricking fingers, scanning retinas. A needle slid into the crook of my arm, drawing blood into a vial labeled with my code. The sensation was sharp, then dull, another pain added to the collection. Numbers flashed on the screens. The Medici watched them with detached interest. "Malnutrition," he murmured. "Chronic fatigue, repetitive strain damage, minor infection." He paused, tilting his head slightly. "Psychological stress markers elevated." I almost laughed at that. Almost. He tapped a sequence into the cogitator. The machine responded with a low chime, then a harsher buzz that made my stomach drop. "Health score below acceptable labor threshold," he said, as calmly as if discussing weather patterns. "Primary assignment viability reduced." I swallowed. "What does that mean?" He looked at me then, really looked, eyes flicking from my face to the screens and back again. For a moment, I thought I saw something like pity. Then it was gone. "Reassignment," he said. "Pending availability." The bands released, and I stepped off the platform on unsteady legs. He handed me a small stamped chit, warm from the printer. It bore my code and a single word, FL Aged. Relief and terror washed through me in equal measure. Relief, because the manufacturer was killing me slowly, and some part of me longed for change, for an end to the endless press and lash. Terror, because change in the Imperium never means mercy. It means optimization. It means being redirected to where you can be most efficiently consumed. In the days that followed, the hab block thinned. Doors were sealed with red wax and warning sigils. Names, numbers were struck from ration ledgers. People I had nodded to in corridors vanished between shifts, their absence absorbed by the hive as easily as their presence had been. Their habs were emptied, scrubbed, and reassigned within a cycle. The hive does not tolerate vacancy. I began to catalogue myself, quietly, obsessively. Which joints still moved freely. Which organs I could feel faltering. How long I could stand without dizziness. I imagined myself as the administrator might see me, not as a woman, not as a widow, but as a collection of components, some degraded, some still serviceable. My hand, the one I had cut on the press, never healed properly. The skin remained tight and shiny, the scar raised and tender. I wondered if that would count against me or in my favor. Damaged flesh can be repurposed. Sometimes that is its highest value. Each time a server skull drifted past my door, I tensed, waiting for the summons. Each time the work bell rang, I half expected my docket to change, my station reassigned. Sleep became shallow and fractured, haunted by dreams of corridors without doors and rooms full of numbered tables. I began to understand that I was living on borrowed classification. Alive, yes, but barely. Balanced on a line drawn by someone who would never know my face. The senses had measured me and found me wanting. Now it was only a matter of deciding how best to use what remained. The summons came during a rest cycle, which felt deliberate. A sharp chime echoed through my hab, followed by the mechanical click of the lumen, globe snapping to full brightness. My eyes burned as I sat up, heart already racing. The wall panel flashed my identification code in stark white lettering, beneath it a simple directive: Repart Medi CAEAMNEDAT. No explanation. No delay permitted. I dressed in silence, fingers clumsy with fatigue. There was no point in bringing anything beyond my documents. Possessions are irrelevant when the Imperium has already decided what it wants from you. As I stepped into the corridor, I saw others emerging from their habs as well, drawn by similar summons. We did not look at one another. Shared fate does not equal shared comfort. The Medici Annex was deeper than the assessment station, tucked away in a section of the hive where the air felt heavier, saturated with sterilizing chemicals, and something far less clean beneath them. The walls were tiled in white ceramite, cracked and stained despite constant scrubbing. The lighting was harsh, unblinking, designed to expose every flaw in flesh. This was not a place of healing. It was a place of conversion. We were processed in small groups. When my turn came, I was led into a chamber dominated by a single metal table, surrounded by articulated arms tipped with tools whose purposes I could only guess. The smell hit me immediately, antiseptic layered over scorched meat, oil, and coppery blood. My stomach clenched, whether from hunger or fear I could not tell. A robed official stood at the foot of the table, face obscured by a hood and rebreather. A cogitator unit hummed at his side, its screen displaying scrolling data tagged with my code. "Your remaining value has been assessed," he said, voice filtered and distant. "Labor output insufficient. Alternative contribution authorized." He gestured, and a servitor stepped forward, its movement stiff and precise. It carried a data slate, which it placed into my trembling hands. The slate displayed a dense block of text in High Gothic, interspersed with seals and sigils of approval. I did not read it. Reading was unnecessary. "Consent is required," the official said. "Refusal constitutes dereliction." I thought of the word treason, though he did not say it aloud. He did not need to. The implication was clear. My thumb hovered over the slate's confirmation rune. I felt strangely calm in that moment, as if some final decision had already been made long before this room, long before my husband's death. The Imperium had been collecting its due from me piece by piece. This was simply the last, most literal tithe. I pressed my thumb down. The rune flared briefly, then dimmed. Somewhere something was logged. The servitor took the slate and stepped away. "Lie down," the official said. I obeyed. The table was cold, even through my thin clothes. Restraints slid into place around my wrists, ankles, chest, and forehead, holding me immobile. The sensation was familiar by now, containment as reassurance. If I could not move, I could not make mistakes. The articulated arms descended. I fixed my gaze on the ceiling, on a long crack running through the ceramite tile above me. I counted its branches, memorized its shape. Anything to keep my mind anchored. The first injection burned as it entered my vein, a chemical chill spreading outward, numbing some sensations while amplifying others. I could still feel. That was intentional. Pain, like faith, is more effective when experienced consciously. There was no countdown, no warning. The first cut was precise, clinical. I felt pressure, then heat, then a deep, nauseating awareness of something being opened that should have remained closed. I clenched my jaw, biting down hard enough that I tasted blood. A scream clawed its way up my throat, but I swallowed it, forcing it back down. Noise would not help me. Noise never helps. The room filled with the sound of tools at work, whirs, clicks, the wet snip of flesh being separated. The smell intensified, overwhelming the antiseptic. Burnt meat. Cauterization. I focused on breathing, slow and shallow, though each breath felt like an effort. At some point, I began to dissociate. My body felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. I watched the process from far away, a detached observer cataloging sensations without ownership. This, too, was a survival technique. Voices murmured above me, discussing metrics and yields. I was not addressed directly. I was an object under modification, my presence acknowledged only through data points and tool adjustments. When it was over, I did not realize it at first. The tools withdrew. The restraints loosened slightly. A heavy numbness settled over me, punctuated by sharp spikes of pain whenever I shifted. Acceptable extraction, the official said. Subject compliant. Compliant. The highest praise. I was wheeled into a recovery bay, if it could be called that. Rows of tables held others like me, some unconscious, some staring blankly at nothing. Tubes ran into arms and throats, machines beeping softly as they monitored vitals. A servitor moved among us, adjusting lines, wiping blood without comment. When I woke fully hours later, or perhaps days, time had lost its meaning. I felt wrong. Something essential was missing. Not just physically, though the pain and absence made that clear, but in a deeper sense. A hollowness where something vital had once been. My body felt lighter and heavier all at once, unbalanced in ways I could not articulate. A new identification mark had been stamped onto my forearm, the skin still raw and tender. It replaced older marks, overwriting them without ceremony. I traced it with trembling fingers, memorizing its shape. This was who I was now, according to the ledger. The pain never left after that. It dulled over time, became a constant background presence, but it never faded entirely. Each movement reminded me of what had been taken, and why. Compliance came easier now. Pain has a way of narrowing focus, stripping away unnecessary thoughts. I was thanked upon discharge. Literally thanked. A form had been added to my docket commending my willingness to endure in service to the throne. There was even a small ration bonus attached, temporary and conditional. I ate that night with shaking hands, the food tasting no better than before. Hunger and pain coexisted, each sharpening the other. I wondered what part of me had been deemed surplus, what function it now served elsewhere in the hive. I did not ask. The Imperium does not reward curiosity. All that mattered was that I had given what was required. I was still alive, still useful. For now, I wait now. That is my function, as surely as the stamping press was once my function, as surely as the knife and needle were. Waiting has its own rhythms, its own rules, and I have learned them quickly. Sit when instructed, stand when told, speak only when prompted. Above all, do not ask why. Waiting is efficient because it consumes time without producing resistance. The holding corridor is long and narrow, its walls painted a pale institutional gray that reflects the light without warmth. Lumen strips run along the ceiling in an unbroken line, never dimming, never flickering. There is no cycle here, no night or day. Time has been flattened into a continuous present, an endless now that stretches until the next summons arrives. I am wrapped in a thin blanket stamped with the Acula, its fabric coarse and faintly damp. It smells of antiseptic and old sweat, layered traces of those who waited here before me. The blanket is not for comfort. It is to standardize us, to reduce visual variance for easier assessment. Under it, my body ache is in familiar, measured ways. The pain from the extraction has settled into something permanent, a low thrum that reminds me I am still here, still catalogued as functional. Along the corridor, others sit on identical benches, spaced at regulation intervals. We do not speak. Some stare straight ahead, eyes glassy, mouths slightly open. Others have closed their eyes, though I doubt they are sleeping. Sleep requires safety, and there is none here. Servo skulls drift silently overhead, their lenses passing over us again and again, counting, verifying. Each time one pauses near me, I straighten my posture instinctively, though I know it makes no difference. I no longer know what I am waiting for. Reassignment perhaps. Transport. Final processing. The words blur together in my mind, stripped of specific meaning. All I know is that I have been moved from one category to another so many times that the original labels no longer fit. Widow, worker, penitent, donor. Each was stamped over the last, ink bleeding through parchment until the text became illegible. I think of my husband sometimes, but even that feels distant now, like recalling a story someone once told me. His face has softened in my memory, details lost, replaced by impressions, the way he counted tokens twice, the way he sighed before sleep. I wonder if his components, his flesh, his labor, were ever reunited with mine in some abstract way. The hive recycles everything. Perhaps some small part of him passed through the same machines that now hum somewhere beyond these walls. The thought does not comfort me. It does not horrify me either. It simply exists. A chime sounds down the corridor, sharp and sudden. One of the others flinches. A door slides open with a hiss, revealing a room I cannot see into from here. A number is called, not a name. The person whose code it is rises on unsteady legs and follows an attendant inside. The door seals behind them. The chime sounds again, softer this time, acknowledging a completed transfer. The bench beside me remains occupied. It is not my turn yet. I pull the blanket tighter around myself, feeling the stamped Aquila press against my skin. Once the symbol inspired something in me, fear, reverence, obligation. Now it feels like a brand, marking ownership. I trace its outline absent-mindedly, the motion slow and repetitive. Waiting encourages such habits. Anything to fill the space between summons. My thoughts drift, not forward but inward. I take inventory, the way I learned to during the census. Heart still beating, though irregularly, lungs burning slightly with each breath. Hands functional, though weaker than before. Mind compliant, that is the important metric. Compliance is the one thing that has never dropped below acceptable levels. I realize, distantly, that I am no longer afraid. Fear requires imagination, and imagination has been worn down by repetition. I know that whatever comes next will hurt, or diminish me further, or erase some remaining piece of myself. I know that it will be explained as necessary. I know that resistance would change nothing except the speed of my removal. These truths have settled into me like sediment, heavy and immovable. The lights do not change. The corridor does not age. Somewhere beyond the walls, the hive roars and grinds and consumes, indifferent to my small, quiet existence. I am one data point among billions. One resource moving through a system too vast to notice individual suffering. I try to speak this confession aloud, to give voice to what I have endured, but the words die in my throat. There is no one to hear them. The corridor absorbs sound the way the hive absorbs lives. Even if I screamed, it would be logged as a disturbance, corrected and forgotten. Perhaps this is mercy of a sort, to be reduced so thoroughly that there is nothing left to take. Another chime. Another number. I breathe in the antiseptic air and let it fill my lungs, then release it slowly. I focus on small things. The hum of the lights, the weight of the blanket, the steady ache in my body. These are proofs of existence, thin but sufficient. In the end, I understand what the Imperium has always asked of me. Not heroism, not faith, truly, only submission, rendered in manageable increments until nothing remains to submit. My life has been perfectly accounted for, every loss logged, every contribution measured, every excess removed. I wait, because waiting is all that is left, and when my number is finally called, I will rise because that, too, is what is required.